I'm a 26-year-old guy, and for most of my life, I was nothing more than an afterthought in my own family. My older brother, Lucas, was the golden child, the firstborn, the pride and joy, the one who could do no wrong. And me, I was just the extra. The one expected to step aside, make sacrifices, and never question why things were the way they were. It started young. Birthdays, Lucas's birthdays were grand affairs, balloons, cakes, and expensive gifts. Mine were simpler, a smaller gathering, a less flashy present, and sometimes even a shared celebration with another family event. It was never explicitly stated that Lucas was more important, but over time the message became clear. His milestones mattered more. School? He went to a private academy with top-tier education, tutors, and extracurriculars. I went to public school and had to figure things out on my own. When Lucas turned 16, my parents handed him the keys to a brand new car. 2 years later, when I turned 16, I was told to start saving for a used one. Whenever I asked why things were different for me, the answer was always the same. Lucas is the firstborn. He has more responsibilities, so he deserves more. That was the rule in our family, the tradition passed down for generations. Firstborns were given everything because they were expected to carry the family name forward. Younger siblings, we were just there. I tried to believe it. Maybe I was being selfish. Maybe I should be grateful that I even had a family. So I kept my head down, worked hard, and didn't ask for much. But then I turned 18, and reality hit me like a brick wall. Lucas was accepted into an expensive university, and my parents were ecstatic. They covered his tuition, bought him everything he needed, and even sent him an allowance every month. A week later, I sat down with them to talk about my plans for college, hoping they'd help me too. Instead, they handed me a stack of job listings and said, "You're an adult now, time to start contributing." Just like that, I was on my own. I didn't even have a chance to process it before they hit me with their next demand: rent. If I wanted to stay in the house, I had to start paying my share. Meanwhile, Lucas, who was living in a fully furnished apartment paid for by them, never had to lift a finger. I barely had time to be angry. I was too busy working 2 jobs just to keep a roof over my head. While my brother partied his way through college, I was juggling late-night shifts at a gas station and morning classes at a community college. Every cent I made went to rent, food, and tuition. My parents, they didn't care. They even had the audacity to tell me I should be proud to help lighten their load. Lucas, of course, found the whole thing hilarious. Whenever he came home for the holidays, he'd make snide remarks about how tired I looked, how I should just ask mom and dad for help like he did, as if I hadn't already tried, as if he didn't know exactly how unfair it all was. The final straw came when I was 20. I had finally saved enough money to move out and transfer to a better college. I was feeling good, like maybe, just maybe, I was finally breaking free. But then my parents sat me down for a family discussion. Lucas had decided to go to grad school, and my parents were already feeling the financial strain. They had stretched themselves thin covering his undergraduate tuition, maxing out their savings and even taking out loans in their name to keep him afloat. Now, with their finances in a precarious state, they turned to me, expecting me to take out loans in my name so Lucas wouldn't have to worry about debt. When I refused, they were furious. They called me selfish, ungrateful, and a disgrace to the family. "Lucas is working towards something great," they said. "You should be happy to support him." That was it. I was done. The next morning, I withdrew every dollar I had, packed my bags, and left. No warning, no goodbye. I changed my number, deleted my social media, and disappeared from their lives completely. The first thing I did, I legally changed my last name. For the first time in my life, I wasn't tied to them anymore. The first few years were hard. I struggled. I had to rebuild everything from scratch. But at least I was free. No more family obligations, no more expectations, no more being treated like a second-class citizen in my own home. I graduated, found a job, and built a life for myself. A life where I wasn't constantly compared to Lucas, where I wasn't just an afterthought, and for 6 years I had peace. Until last week, I was at work when I got the email.
The subject line? I need your help. It was from Lucas.
Over the years, I had heard through distant acquaintances that Lucas' business wasn't doing as well as he liked to pretend. Investors were pulling out, he was losing money fast, and creditors were closing in. At first, he tried to keep up appearances, pretending he was still successful. But when even our parents could no longer fund his failures, the facade crumbled. He was desperate. And now, for the first time, he needed me. And just like that, the past came crashing back. For 6 years, I hadn't heard a word from Lucas or my parents. Not a single email, text, or phone call. It was like I never existed to them, which was exactly what I wanted. I had built my own life, free from their expectations and manipulations. Then, out of nowhere, an email popped up in my inbox. The subject line was simple: "I need your help." It was from Lucas. The message was long, almost too long. He went on and on about how things had taken a turn for the worse. His business had failed. He was drowning in debt. The bank was coming after him. He was this close to losing everything. At first, I thought it was some kind of mistake. Maybe a scam. Maybe he had meant to send it to someone else. But no, he mentioned details from our childhood, things only he would know, and then right at the end, he dropped the real reason he was reaching out. Our parents were struggling too. He didn't say how or why, just that they were really having a hard time. And since I had a good life now, it was my turn to step up. I read the email twice, 3 times, then I shut my laptop and walked away. For hours I tried to ignore it, but curiosity got the better of me. So I did what anyone would do in my situation. I went digging. It didn't take long to find out what had really happened. Lucas' business had been teetering on the edge for years, barely keeping itself afloat through risky investments and overpromises. At first, he found moderate success, but cracks had been forming behind the scenes, unpaid debts, failed deals, and lawsuits piling up. Eventually, it all came crashing down, leading to articles, forum posts, and even a few news reports exposing his mismanagement and fraudulent practices. Apparently, he had been running some kind of investment firm that promised big returns. The usual stuff: flashy marketing, expensive suits, and over-the-top confidence. But it turned out the whole thing was shady. Clients lost money. Lawsuits were filed, the company shut down, and Lucas was left with nothing. And my parents, well, they had been funding his business ventures from the start. For years, they had poured money into him, fully convinced that their golden child was destined for success. And now that everything had fallen apart, they had nothing left. It was almost funny. I had spent my entire life being told I wasn't worth investing in, that Lucas was the future of our family, that all the sacrifices were necessary to support his greatness. And now, they were broke, and they wanted me to clean up their mess. I deleted the email. The next day, my phone started buzzing. Unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. Another call, another, then a text. "We need to talk. Please pick up." It was my mother. I hadn't heard her voice in years, but the second I played the voicemail, I recognized the tone. That same sweet but guilting way she used to talk whenever she wanted something. She didn't acknowledge the past, didn't ask how I was doing. Instead, she jumped straight into "we still family." I stopped listening after that. For the next week, the messages kept coming. Different numbers, different attempts to make me feel guilty. Lucas sent another email, this time shorter and angrier. He accused me of abandoning the family, of turning my back on them when they needed me most. I ignored it. Then my parents sent their own version of an apology. They admitted they had made mistakes. They could have treated me better, but they never actually said sorry. Instead, they just kept circling back to the same message. Family sticks together. I finally responded with a single sentence: "I am not your backup plan." The next day, another email came in, this time an ultimatum. If I really cared about family, I would come home and help. If I didn't, then they would know where I stood. That made things easy. I cut off every avenue they had to reach me. Emails, phone numbers, even mutual connections who tried to guilt me into talking to them. Of course, it wasn't as simple as pressing a button. Some relatives tried reaching out in person. Others used new numbers or fake accounts. But I held firm. My boundaries were non-negotiable. I thought that was the end of it. Then, 3 days later, I heard a knock at my door. When I opened it, Lucas was standing outside. The second I opened the door, I knew things had gone from bad to worse. Lucas stood there, looking nothing like the brother I remembered. His expensive clothes, once the kind he'd flaunt, were wrinkled and unkempt. Dark circles lined his eyes, his hair was a mess, and for the first time in his life, he looked like someone who had been hit by reality. He tried to step forward, but I didn't move. At first, he acted like this was just another conversation, like we were still brothers catching up after years apart. But his voice wavered. He wasn't here for a friendly reunion. He was desperate. He started talking, fast, about how bad things had gotten, how our parents were struggling, how he had no one else, how I was the only person who could fix this. It wasn't even a request. It was an expectation. I didn't say a word. I didn't invite him in. That's when the guilt tripping started. He talked about how mom and dad were barely getting by, how they had sacrificed everything for both of us, not just him, how family sticks together, how I was making things harder than they needed to be. I still didn't move. Then his voice changed. He went from pleading to frustrated. His face twisted like he couldn't believe I wasn't immediately caving in, like I was the one being difficult. He said I was selfish, that I was turning my back on family, that my little grudge had gone on long enough. I finally responded. I reminded him of every single thing our parents had done, how they had never once treated me as an equal, how I had been thrown out at 18 with nothing while he had been handed everything, how I had spent years scraping by while he lived like a king. His response? A shrug. That's just how things were. You should have understood. That was it. That was all he had to say. No remorse, no regret, just the same attitude he had always had, that I was supposed to accept being treated like less, because that's what had been decided for me. For the first time, I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel resentment. I just felt done. I told him he needed to leave. That's when the meltdown happened. He started ranting, saying I would regret this, that I was making a huge mistake, that I had let outside influences turn me against my own family, that I was just bitter because he had always been more successful. That last part almost made me laugh. I let him talk. I let him throw every last insult he could think of. Then I told him something I should have said years ago. Our past? It didn't mean anything now. Whatever relationship we had as kids, whatever bond he thought we shared, it was over. The moment I walked away from that family, I stopped being their safety net. I owed him nothing. His face turned red, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Then, without another word, he turned and stormed off. An hour later, I got a final email from my parents. It was short. They were deeply disappointed in me. I blocked them. I thought it was over. Then, the next day, a mutual acquaintance reached out. Apparently, Lucas and my parents weren't done with me yet. They had a new plan to drag me back in, and it was worse than I could have imagined. It started with a single message. A mutual acquaintance, someone I hadn't spoken to in years, reached out with a warning. They told me to be careful because my family was planning something drastic. I asked what they meant. The response made my blood run cold. I started noticing a pattern, messages from distant relatives asking vague questions about my finances. Some hinted that I had done well for myself, while others outright asked if I had hit the jackpot. Confused, I asked around. That's when I found out the lie Lucas and my parents had been spreading, that I was secretly rich, hoarding money while they suffered. When I addressed it publicly, I made one thing clear. Whatever money I had was earned, not handed to me, and I owed them nothing. They weren't just telling people I was doing well, they were making it sound like I had hit the jackpot. Some versions of the story claimed I had won the lottery. Others said I had gotten a massive inheritance from some unknown relative. One of the more ridiculous ones was that I had invested in crypto early and was now sitting on millions. No matter the version, the conclusion was the same. I had abandoned my family despite being wealthy. Lucas and my parents had crafted a sob story about how they were struggling while I was apparently hoarding money, refusing to help them out of pure selfishness. I didn't think much of it until the messages started coming in. Aunts, uncles, cousins I hadn't heard from in years suddenly crawled out of the woodwork. They weren't asking how I was. They weren't checking in after years of silence. They were demanding I do the right thing. Some were subtle, asking how I had been, how work was going, whether I had been blessed financially. Others were straight up aggressive, accusing me of turning my back on the family. One relative even sent me their bank details and asked for a small loan. At first, I was confused. Then I saw Lucas's social media. He had been posting vague messages about betrayal, talking about how family should stick together and money changes people. He painted himself as a victim, the struggling older brother abandoned by a heartless sibling who had everything. My parents weren't much better. They made a public Facebook post, writing about how some children forget where they come from once they reach success. The comments were filled with relatives and old family friends eating up every word. I called Lucas. The second he picked up, I demanded to know why he was spreading lies about me. He didn't even bother denying it. Instead, he smugly told me, well, maybe if you acted like family, we wouldn't have to tell people this. That was it. That was their plan. They weren't just after money, they wanted control. They wanted to pressure me into stepping back into my old role. The lesser sibling, the one who existed to sacrifice for the family. They thought if they backed me into a corner, I would crack. I didn't. I told him, if you think I have money, then go ahead and sue me for it. Otherwise, leave me alone. Then I hung up and started blocking people. Every single person who messaged me, guilt-tripped me, or demanded I help got blocked. I deleted old contacts, removed distant relatives from my social media, and cut off every avenue they had to reach me. But I wasn't taking any chances. A friend who had seen situations like this spiral out of control advised me to take legal precautions. They told me to watch for identity theft attempts, fake credit applications, and any financial moves made in my name. I thought they were being paranoid. Then the letter came. It was an official legal notice claiming that Lucas and my parents were suing me. The reason, unjust enrichment. They were arguing that because I had benefited from family resources as a child, I now owed them financial compensation for all the support they had given me growing up. It was insane, and I wasn't about to let them get away with it. The official legal notice arrived a few days later. Lucas and my parents were actually suing me. The claim, unjust enrichment. According to them, I had benefited from family resources as a child, food, shelter, basic necessities, and now that I was doing well, I owed them back compensation for everything they had given me. They were demanding a large sum of money, claiming that without their sacrifices, I would never have been able to build a life for myself. It would have been laughable if it wasn't so pathetic. I took the documents straight to a lawyer. The moment my lawyer read them, they shook their head. The case had no legal standing. It was an obvious cash grab, a desperate attempt to intimidate me into paying them off. But we weren't going to ignore it. My lawyer advised me to take it seriously, not because they could win, but because if I didn't respond, they could drag it out and cause unnecessary stress. So, we prepared a counterattack. A formal legal response was drafted, completely dismissing their claims and warning that if they pursued this further, they could be held responsible for my legal fees. Then, things took an unexpected turn. I had kept everything quiet, no public posts, no drama. But somehow, word got out. Distant relatives, old acquaintances, even people who had once sided with Lucas and my parents found out what they were doing, and people did not take their side. The entire family's reputation started crumbling. The same relatives who had been guilt-tripping me weeks ago were now turning on Lucas and my parents. Some reached out to apologize for believing the lies. Others sent screenshots of family group chats where people were mocking the lawsuit. Even people who had never taken an interest in my life before were suddenly reaching out, saying things like I can't believe they would do this to their own son. Then, Lucas made a huge mistake. He started deleting his social media accounts, all the posts about family betrayal, gone. The cryptic messages about how money changes people, deleted. But it was too late. Screenshots had already been shared, and the fact that he was trying to erase everything made him look even worse. Meanwhile, my parents were in full panic mode. They had completely miscalculated how people would react. They assumed that by making me look like the villain, the family would rally around them. Instead, they were getting called out left and right. That's when the desperate calls started. One voicemail after another, begging me to settle, claiming they never meant for things to go this far. They pleaded with me to just give them something so this wouldn't ruin the family's name. I didn't respond. Then Lucas tried backtracking. He sent me an email saying this was all just a misunderstanding, that my parents were the ones pushing for the lawsuit, that he had no choice but to go along with it. He even hinted that if I agreed to a private settlement, he could convince them to drop it. It was the same manipulation tactics they had used my entire life. I forwarded the email to my lawyer. They sent a formal counter notice. If they didn't withdraw the lawsuit immediately, we would pursue defamation charges. Within 48 hours, the case was dropped. And the best part, Lucas and my parents were now stuck with the legal fees. The lawsuit had backfired completely. They had thought they could scare me into paying them. Instead, they ended up with an even bigger financial mess, one that they had to clean up themselves. Then, the final message came, an email from my parents. They claimed they had learned their lesson. The message was laced with regret, talking about missed opportunities to be a better family. But between the lines, I could see the pattern, the unspoken expectation that an apology was enough to erase everything. And of course, it came with a request for financial help. I responded with 2 words, not happening. Then I blocked them, for good. Weeks passed, and for the first time in years, everything was quiet. No emails, no calls, no sudden visits. Then, just when I thought they had finally given up, another email popped up in my inbox. It was from my parents. The subject line, "We finally understand." The message started with what looked like an apology. They claimed they realized their mistakes and wanted to make amends. They talked about how family was important and how they never should have let things get this bad. It sounded almost genuine. Then the guilt tripping started. They begged me to come home. They said life was too short for grudges. They warned me that I would regret cutting them off. They tried to paint it as if I was being cruel by refusing to give family another chance. I didn't respond. A day later, Lucas emailed me separately. His message was different, short, direct. He admitted that he had taken things too far. He said he messed up and wanted to make things right. He even said he understood why I was angry. I ignored that one too. It was too sudden, too calculated. And I was right not to trust them, because the next day, everything exploded. My parents went public. They posted a long, dramatic message on Facebook about how I had abandoned them. They talked about how they raised me, gave me everything, and I turned my back on them in their time of need. Not one word about the lawsuit. No mention of how they tried to extort money from me. No mention of how they had lied to our extended family or how they dragged my name through the mud. They made themselves look like the victims. And Lucas, he started posting cryptic messages about family betrayal again. They wanted sympathy. They wanted strangers to take their side. But it backfired, because this time people spoke up. Mutual friends, old classmates, even some distant relatives, people who had stayed neutral before, called them out. The lawsuit wasn't a secret. People knew what had happened. And now, the same people who once defended my family were turning against them. Lucas's financial struggles weren't exactly a secret either. Rumors spread that he was broke, that he had lost most of his friends, that his business failures had made him a joke. People started putting 2 and 2 together, and suddenly the support my family had been hoping for wasn't there. Then, the final act of desperation. Lucas sent me one last message. It was a threat. "If you don't help us," he wrote, "we'll release private information about your past." It was supposed to scare me. It didn't. I responded with one sentence. "Do it. See how that works out for you." Nothing happened, because there wasn't anything to expose. It was just another lie. Another empty attempt to get control over me. So, I expanded the block list. Blocked Lucas. Blocked my parents. Blocked every single person, still trying to guilt trip me. And that was it. I moved on, and I thrived. Months later, I heard through a mutual acquaintance that Lucas had to move back in with our parents. They were all struggling. Meanwhile, I had never been better, and I never looked back. Months passed. With my family blocked and cut off, life finally felt normal. No drama, no guilt tripping, no sudden pleas for help. For the first time in years, I was truly free from their nonsense. Until I got a call from my bank. They had flagged suspicious activity on my account, multiple failed login attempts, and an unauthorized attempt to change my password. The representative on the phone sounded concerned, asking if I had recently tried to access my account from an unfamiliar location. I hadn't. Then they hit me with the part that made my stomach drop. Someone had answered my old security questions correctly. Not just any questions, family-related ones. The name of my first pet. The street I grew up on. My mother's maiden name. Only one group of people could have possibly known those answers. I told the bank to freeze my accounts immediately. Within minutes, I was locked out of everything. Credit cards, savings, even the emergency fund I had built over the years. I spent the next hour changing every password I had, switching security questions, enabling two-factor authentication on everything. Then, I called my lawyer. The bank took the fraud attempt seriously, launching an investigation into the unauthorized login attempts. A few weeks later, they contacted me with a concerning update. The attempted access came from a known location, my parents' home. It wasn't just guilt-tripping or legal threats anymore. They had actually tried to steal from me. I sent a single message to my parents. I know what you did. You have 24 hours to return any stolen money, or I'm pressing charges. The denial came almost instantly. They acted shocked, claimed they had no idea what I was talking about, said there must be a mistake. Then Lucas messaged me. He admitted he had tried to access my account, but not to steal. No, according to him, he was just trying to check my finances so he could help mom and dad. I told him exactly what it was called, fraud, and I promised him there would be consequences. That's when I filed the police report. The bank had already flagged the fraudulent activity, and with the IP trace confirming where it had come from, it was officially a criminal matter. An investigation started immediately, and my parents, they lost their minds. They started calling, begging me to drop it. One message after another, pleas, excuses, sob stories about how this would ruin the family. Then they tried to twist the narrative. They went back to Facebook and posted a long, dramatic rant about how I was trying to have my own family arrested over a misunderstanding. They painted themselves as the victims. But this time, it didn't work. Because now the extended family knew the full truth. Some of them had already distanced themselves after the lawsuit fiasco. Now, with actual fraud on the table, even the ones who had originally defended my parents were disgusted. People called them out. Some relatives publicly commented on their post, asking why they had tried to access my bank account in the first place. Others outright told them to own up to what they did. And then the inevitable happened. Lucas was taken in for questioning. The police didn't waste time. With the bank's cooperation and the clear digital evidence, Lucas was brought in. The golden child, the one who had been handed everything his whole life. Now he was finally facing real consequences. The moment Lucas was taken in for questioning, my family lost their minds. My parents went into full panic mode. They immediately started damage control, trying to convince anyone who would listen that this was all a misunderstanding. Their first excuse, someone must have framed him. They claimed an outsider must have used their home's Wi-Fi to access my accounts, that Lucas had nothing to do with it. That excuse didn't last long, because the bank records didn't lie. The police had clear digital evidence tying Lucas directly to the attempted fraud. When confronted, his defense was pathetic. He claimed he was just checking my accounts to see if I actually had money, because he wanted to borrow some. That's right, he tried to hack into my bank account because he wanted to see if I could afford to bail him out. And somehow, in his mind, that wasn't a crime. Despite my parents begging and pleading, the authorities refused to drop the case. That's when my parents tried to bribe me. Through a mutual connection, they sent a message offering me money from Lucas's failed business if I dropped the charges. It was almost comical. They were so desperate that they were willing to hand over what little they had left just to save Lucas. I sent back a simple response. You had no problem trying to steal from me. Now deal with the consequences. Then, Lucas's real betrayal came to light. A cousin reached out with something I hadn't known before. Apparently, for months Lucas had been bad-mouthing me behind my back, telling people that I was selfish, greedy, and heartless. At the same time, he was secretly planning to steal from me. So not only had he tried to hack into my accounts, but he had been playing the victim while doing it. Then my mother had her final public meltdown. She posted a long Facebook rant about how no child should ever turn against their family. She talked about how I had abandoned them, how Lucas didn't deserve this, how I was being cruel for letting my own brother suffer. But this time, it didn't work. Some extended family members called her out. For the first time, they told her she was wrong. Because no matter what, theft was inexcusable. And Lucas, he started losing everything. His friends abandoned him. His business partners cut him off. His name became toxic, and my parents, realizing they had run out of options, made one last excuse. They started telling people that Lucas was mentally unwell, that he had been struggling for a long time, that he wasn't in the right state of mind when he did what he did. They wanted sympathy. They didn't get it, because at the end of the day, the law didn't care. Lucas was officially charged with attempted fraud. My parents sent one final message. They begged me, one last time, to drop everything. They told me this would ruin Lucas' life. I sent one last text to Lucas. You ruined your own life the moment you tried to steal from me.
Iksu, we're done forever.
Then I blocked them all. The legal case against Lucas moved quickly. With clear evidence of attempted fraud, he had no real defense. The prosecution didn't even have to try hard. Bank records, IP logs, and his own pathetic excuse of I was just checking if I could borrow money sealed his fate. He was convicted and ordered to pay restitution for damages. But there was a problem. Lucas didn't have the money. So the financial collapse of my parents started immediately. The legal fees alone had already drained them. But now, they were responsible for covering what Lucas couldn't pay. A cousin, one of the few relatives who still occasionally reached out, dropped a bombshell. My parents were on the verge of losing their house. Apparently, over the years they had poured everything into Lucas. Every spare dollar, every financial decision, it had all been about keeping him afloat, believing he was destined for success. But he wasn't. and now they had nothing left. Lucas had to move back in with them, unemployed, disgraced, and now a convicted fraudster. Even the few relatives who had originally supported them started cutting ties. No one wanted to be associated with people who had tried to scam their own family. Meanwhile, I was doing the exact opposite. I thrived. I had a stable career, good friends, a peaceful life. I had left behind all the drama, all the guilt, all the manipulation. Then, out of nowhere, my parents made one last pathetic attempt. A handwritten letter arrived at my home. They claimed they still loved me, that they wanted to fix things, that they regretted what happened. I didn't even open it. I tossed it in the fireplace and watched it burn. A year passed. Then, out of nowhere, Lucas reached out again. A LinkedIn message. He wanted to talk. Blocked. Instantly. I didn't even read the full message. By then, word had spread that my parents had lost most of their friends due to their lies and manipulations. Lucas' reputation was destroyed forever. No one wanted to work with him. No one wanted to associate with him. And me, I had closure. For the first time in my life, I was completely free. No baggage. No family expectations. Just peace. And in the end, that was the ultimate revenge.